A volcano on the highest alert of its recorded history. An earthquake scientists warned about 13 years ago. And a government that changed its own death toll twice in one day. Colombia didn't just get unlucky on Monday morning. It got hit by 3 warnings that had been building for weeks, and almost nobody outside the country was watching. Guys, let me start with the moment itself, because I think this is what people are not really understanding yet. It's 7:34 in the morning, Monday, Western Colombia. Picture yourself sitting on an airplane, maybe still on the runway waiting for takeoff, or maybe already climbing into the sky. Picture being on a commuter train, or sitting in a cable car, suspended hundreds of feet, above a hillside, because that's actually how a lot of commuting works in cities like Pereira and Manizales. Now picture the ground, or the air around you, suddenly moving in a way it's not supposed to move. I don't know if I can even really imagine that, honestly, but I don't have to imagine it, because the footage coming out of Colombia right now shows exactly that kind of moment. People getting kids ready for school, commuters on buses, people literally hanging in cable cars above the hillsides, and then a 7.4 magnitude earthquake hits, one of the strongest this country has felt in decades, and for the people up in those cable cars, there was nowhere to go. They were just stuck, suspended in the air, while the hillsides below them kept shaking. It took about 6 hours before rescue crews got everyone out of those cable cars safely. 6 hours, guys. Imagine that. And honestly, that's one of the better outcomes from Monday morning, because for a lot of other people in Colombia, it did not end that way. So let's talk about where this actually happened, because the location matters a lot more than people realize. The epicenter was near a town called San Jose del Palmar, in the Choco region of Western Colombia. This is roughly 250 miles, or about 400 kilometers, from the capital, Bogota, and it's a pretty remote, underdeveloped part of the country, which is actually going to become a huge problem later in this video when we talk about why information is coming out so slowly. The shaking wasn't just local either. We're talking about a quake that was felt across 4 countries. People in Bogota evacuated buildings. It was felt in Cali, in Barranquilla, all the way on the coast, and even across the border in Ecuador and Panama. Something like 10.5 million people experienced strong to very strong shaking, according to the U.S. Geological Survey. And honestly, the number of people who felt something even lighter shaking is estimated at over 30 million. Let that sink in for a second. 30 million people in one morning felt the ground move because of this thing. Now here's where I need to get a little technical with you, because this actually matters for understanding why the damage looks the way it does and why we got lucky in one specific way. This was not what people usually picture when they think Colombia earthquake. Colombia sits right along a very active part of the Pacific Ring of Fire, where the Nazca Plate is basically diving underneath the South American plate offshore. That kind of earthquake, a subduction zone quake, is usually what triggers the really catastrophic tsunami scenarios. But this one was different. This was what's called an intraplate strike-slip earthquake. Basically, instead of 2 plates grinding against each other at the boundary, this was stress building up and releasing inside the Nazca Plate itself, at a fairly significant depth, somewhere between 96 and 107 kilometers down, depending on whether you're looking at the U.S. Geological Survey's numbers or Colombia's own geological service. That's roughly 60 to 66 miles straight down. And because it was a strike-slip rupture, similar in mechanism to something like California's San Andreas Fault and not a subduction event, we did not get a tsunami out of this. That's genuinely the one piece of good news in this entire story. But here's the thing, and this is where it gets uncomfortable. Scientists were not surprised that this could happen. This is not some freak out-of-nowhere event. There have been studies going back over a decade, warning that this specific kind of intraplate seismic activity was possible in this region. People had flagged this risk before. And I think that's honestly one of the most important things to understand about disasters like this. It's rarely that nobody saw it coming. It's that the warning sits in a research paper or a geological bulletin somewhere, and life goes on, because that's what life does, until the day it doesn't. Let's talk numbers now, because the numbers themselves are a story in this disaster. When the president first addressed the country, the preliminary figures were 111 people dead and 87 injured. That was the number that went out first. That was on the news. That's the number a lot of international outlets picked up initially. But within hours, the Colombian Association of Capital Cities, which is basically tracking this independently across the country's major cities, put the number at 132 dead and 570 injured. Now, I want to be really careful with how I frame this, because I don't think this is a correction exactly. I don't think anyone got it wrong on purpose. What's actually happening here is the gap between what's officially confirmed by the central government at any given moment and what rescue teams are actually finding as they dig through the rubble in real time. And unfortunately, guys, we've seen this pattern before. It happened with the twin earthquakes in Venezuela back in June. The number you hear on day 1 is never the final number. It only moves in one direction, and that direction is up. And on top of the confirmed deaths and injuries, there are still hundreds of people reported missing. Some reports put the number of missing persons reports at well over 2,000 as of Monday night, with families posting information about loved ones on citizen-run websites because official channels weren't fast enough or reachable enough in some of the harder-hit areas. There's one story that's been circulating about a woman looking for her 60-year-old uncle, a farmer who lived in a fragile stick-and-mud house in a rural area near the epicenter, in a town called El Cairo. Local authorities are saying something like 80% of that town, which has around 7,000 residents, sustained damage. That's the kind of number that doesn't always make the front page, but it tells you everything about how uneven this disaster is. The cities get the camera crews. The small rural towns near the epicenter get silence, and that silence is honestly scarier because it usually means help hasn't gotten there yet. Not that everything is fine. Now let's get into the aftershocks, because this is the part that I think people underestimate the most. Within hours of the main quake, there were at least 21 aftershocks. Most of them were small, barely noticeable, but at least one hit magnitude 5. 0, less than an hour after the main shock. There was also one around magnitude 4. 8. Now, on a normal day, a magnitude 5. 0 earthquake would be a big story on its own. On a day like Monday, it barely even registers as news because it's just one of 20-plus aftershocks. But here's the number that's getting misused online right now, and I really want to clear this up for you guys. There's a statistic going around that says there's roughly a 5% chance that any earthquake is followed by a larger one nearby within a week. People are taking that number and treating it like a Columbia-specific forecast. Like it's telling us exactly what's going to happen next. It's not. That 5% figure from the U.S. Geological Survey is a global average across every earthquake sequence on the planet. It's not custom-built for Colombia's fault system, and it's definitely not a guarantee of safety either. Remember, Venezuela in June had 2 quakes, a 7, 2, and then a 7. 5, and they hit within about 39 seconds of each other. So while the 5% statistic technically means there's a 95% chance the first quake was the biggest one in the sequence, it does not mean the danger is over, and it definitely doesn't mean people should treat the aftershock window casually. What we do know, and what's actually more useful than a single probability number, is the general pattern of how aftershock sequences behave. Aftershocks are almost always strongest and most frequent right after the main shock, and then they gradually taper off over time. That tapering can take days, it can take weeks. Sometimes, depending on the earthquake, it can take much longer than that. And the mathematical pattern behind it is fairly consistent, roughly dropping off in proportion to how much time has passed since the main event. Which means the most dangerous window, statistically speaking, is right now in these first few days after the quake. And that's genuinely terrifying when you think about what dangerous means in this specific context, because it's not just about new buildings falling down. It's about buildings that survived Monday morning, but are now structurally compromised, sitting there, cracked, weakened, essentially loaded and waiting. I want you to really sit with that idea for a second, because I think it's the single most important thing in this whole story. A building that's still standing after Sunday, or after Monday morning in this case, is not automatically a safe building. Every cracked wall in a city like Cali right now, every leaning facade in a place like Pereira, that structure has already been weakened. It's already absorbed damage that it wasn't designed to handle. And an aftershock that would have done basically nothing to that same building a week ago, something small, a magnitude 4 point something, could be enough to finish it off now. That's an enormous risk, not just for residents who might go back into their homes too soon, but especially for the rescue workers who are physically inside collapsed and half-collapsed structures right now, trying to pull people out from underneath the rubble, while the ground keeps moving underneath them too. There's actually a strange silver lining buried in the depth of this earthquake, and I mentioned it earlier, but I want to come back to it because it's genuinely important. The main shock happened at a depth of somewhere around 96 to 107 kilometers, straight down. That depth is part of the reason we didn't see even more catastrophic destruction. Scientists have pointed out that this distance, this depth, actually spared Colombia from a much worse outcome. I don't love the word spared, honestly, because 132 people are dead, and that's not something you describe as being spared from anything. But from a pure physics standpoint, had this same magnitude of earthquake happened at a much shallower depth, closer to the surface, the shaking at ground level would have been dramatically more intense, and in densely populated areas, that would have meant a lot more collapsed buildings, and almost certainly a much higher death toll. Aftershocks in a sequence like this also tend to occur at similar depths to the main rupture, so we're not expecting the aftershocks to suddenly be shallower and therefore more damaging than the main quake was. That's the good news, if you can call it that. This wasn't the worst-case scenario earthquake that this fault system is capable of producing. Now let's talk about the ground itself, because the earthquake didn't just damage buildings, it destabilized entire hillsides. and that's a problem that doesn't go away when the shaking stops. Colombian authorities have issued warnings for landslides and soil liquefaction. These warnings are affecting somewhere in the range of 430,000 people. That's a massive number of people living in areas where the ground itself might not be stable anymore, and the timing here could not be worse, because the weather forecast for the middle of this week includes showers and thunderstorms across western Colombia, including around Bogota, and western Colombia is exactly the region that took the worst of the earthquake damage. So think about what that actually means on the ground. You've already got loose soil, slopes that have been shaken and weakened by the main quake and by the ongoing aftershocks. Now you're adding rainfall on top of that, which saturates hillsides and makes them even more likely to give way. And underneath all of this, you have rescue teams physically climbing through debris piles by hand, trying to reach people who are still trapped on unstable slopes in the rain with aftershocks still happening. It's an incredibly dangerous combination of conditions for the people doing the actual rescue work. Colombia's vice president has traveled to Manizales, one of the hardest hit cities, to run a unified command post directly from the disaster zone. And according to people involved in the aid response, the hardest part of this operation isn't actually locating people who need help. It's finding buildings that are structurally safe enough to even operate out of, in cities where the ground keeps shaking. We've seen hospitals with collapsed sections, including pediatric and neonatal units in a hospital in Cali. We've seen airport terminals with ceiling damage, with footage showing pieces of ceiling falling on travelers who were sheltering during the quake, and people running through rubble at the Pereira airport in a panic. Multiple airports across the region, including Manizales, Quibdó, Armenia, Cartago, Buenaventura, and Pereira, had to suspend flight operations either because of structural damage or because of the volcanic ash we're going to get into shortly. I think one detail really puts the scale of this event into perspective, and it's something that explains the damage better than any death toll or magnitude number could. The last time this specific region of Colombia experienced anything close to what happened on Monday was back in 1938, and the last earthquake of magnitude 6. 5 or larger in this general area was back in 1995. What that means, practically speaking, is that almost every modern building standing in Western Colombia right now has never actually been tested by shaking this strong. Not once. Monday was the real test, and we saw plenty of buildings that looked completely modern, contemporary construction, come down anyway. In Manizales specifically, one of the cathedral's towers actually broke off and fell straight through the roof into the nave below. When people first saw footage of that, a lot of folks online assumed it had to be some kind of AI-generated video or an exaggeration, because it looked almost unreal. It wasn't. It happened. Mayor Jorge Eduardo Rojas said that 17 buildings in Manizales had fully collapsed, with another 19 partially collapsed. In Pereira, the mayor described the situation as people trapped under what he called a massive quantity of collapsed buildings, and reported at least 18 deaths in that city alone. In Cali, a city of about 2 million people, residents were trapped in at least 19 separate collapsed buildings, according to the mayor there. Interestingly, the towns that actually experienced the most violent shaking weren't necessarily the famous, larger cities you'd expect. 2 smaller towns, Zarzal and Cartago, ended up in the zone of most intense shaking, affecting roughly 2 million people combined, with the U.S. Geological Survey rating the shaking intensity there at a 7 on their scale, which is described as violent, not just strong or alarming, but violent. The U.S. Geological Survey has this event listed at their orange alert level for estimated impact, which for context is a serious tier, reserved for events expected to have significant humanitarian and economic consequences. And it reflects the likelihood that the death toll could ultimately land somewhere between 100 and 1,000 people. To put that in perspective against a regional comparison, the twin earthquakes that hit Venezuela back in June ended up killing more than 6,000 people, and honestly, a lot of people following this story don't think the current Colombia number is anywhere near its final resting point either. Now, as I record this, the official count sits around 132, but based on how these situations have played out before, that number is very likely to keep climbing over the coming days. Part of the reason information is moving so slowly out of the region closest to the epicenter comes down to infrastructure. The province around the center of the affected jungle region is dealing with serious road damage and ongoing connectivity problems, meaning there's still very little detailed information coming out of the towns closest to where the earthquake actually originated. That's genuinely concerning, because it usually means the situation there is at least as bad, if not worse, than what's being reported from the more accessible cities. There's a pattern here that unfortunately repeats in disaster after disaster. The first few days after an event like this are considered the rescue window, when there's still a realistic chance of pulling survivors out from under rubble alive. After that window closes, the operation effectively shifts from rescue to recovery, which is really just a more clinical way of describing a much worse outcome for the families still waiting on news. Okay, now let's get into the volcano, because I promised you I'd get here. And this is honestly the part of the story that's getting the most misinformation attached to it right now. A lot of headlines and social media posts are framing this as earthquake triggers massive volcanic eruption in Colombia. And I want to walk you through why that framing is, at best, an oversimplification. And Colombia's own geological service has actually gone out of its way publicly to push back on that exact claim. The volcano in question is called Purase, located near the city of Popayan in the Cauca department, part of what's known as the Los Coconucos volcanic chain. This is a popular hiking destination under normal circumstances, and it's also one of the more historically active volcanoes in Colombia, with large explosive eruptions on record going back to the 1800s and through the mid-1900s. Here's the key detail, though. On August 1st, more than a week before the earthquake even happened, Colombia's Geological Service raised Purase's alert level from yellow to orange. That's a significant jump. Under Colombia's alert system, orange essentially means the possibility of a major eruption has increased, without it necessarily meaning an eruption is guaranteed or imminent. The reason they raised it wasn't random either. They were tracking a sharp increase in seismic energy occurring roughly a kilometer underneath the crater, along with dramatic changes in volcanic gas and ash emissions, ground deformation between the Purase, Piacolo, and Curiquinga volcanic systems, and rising sulfur dioxide output. According to the Geological Service, these were the highest instrumental values ever recorded for this particular volcano since they started monitoring it. And this buildup wasn't some brand new development either. Looking at the volcano's recent history, it had already been raised to orange once before, back in late November of last year, after ash emissions started happening that hadn't been recorded there since 1977. That alert level actually came back down to yellow by late January this year, before climbing straight back up to orange on August 1st because activity kept escalating. So by the time the earthquake hit on Monday morning, Purase was already sitting at its highest level of documented activity since the early 1990s. Ash columns from the volcano had already been recorded, reaching heights of up to 3,400 meters above the crater in the days just before the quake. On August 8th specifically, 2 days before the earthquake, there were reports of an eruption sending ash roughly 2 kilometers into the air. Then Monday's earthquake hit, and within hours, Purase put out ash again, enough that civil aviation authorities suspended operations at the airport in Popayan over the risk to aircraft engines. The Geological Service recorded 5 separate ash emissions in that 24-hour window around the earthquake. And this is exactly the moment where the earthquake triggered the volcano narrative took off online, because on the surface, the timing looks almost too perfect. Massive earthquake, volcano erupts hours later. Of course, people are going to connect those dots. But Colombia's Geological Service addressed this directly because apparently people were sending them this exact claim across social media in huge numbers. Their official position is that the volcanic ash activity and the earthquake are independent natural processes, and that there is no confirmed link between the two events. And honestly, when you actually lay out the timeline the way I just did for you, it makes a lot of sense. Purase had been building toward this level of activity for weeks, arguably since around July 20th, based on the pattern of seismic and gas data the Geological Service has published. The volcano was already at its highest documented alert status in decades before the earthquake ever occurred. Now, I do think there's a more nuanced way to think about this, and it's the same logic we talked about earlier with the buildings. If something is already right at the edge, already primed and close to happening on its own, then a nearby seismic event, even one that isn't geologically connected in a direct causal sense, could potentially act as a final nudge. The same way an aftershock might be the thing that brings down a building that was already structurally compromised. That's different from saying the earthquake caused the eruption, though. It's more that Purase was very likely heading toward increased activity regardless, and the earthquake happened to land in the middle of that separate, already unfolding process. If you see people online confidently stating that this earthquake directly triggered a volcanic eruption in Colombia, you can go ahead and push back on that, because Colombia's own scientists have specifically and publicly rejected that framing. For what it's worth, we do know from other parts of the world that massive earthquakes absolutely can influence volcanic systems under certain conditions. The magnitude 8 earthquake that struck Kamchatka was linked to volcanic activity there. So it's not that the general idea of earthquake-volcano interaction is impossible or unscientific. It's just that in this specific Colombia case, with this specific volcano, the Geological Service is telling us the timing is a coincidence layered on top of an already independently escalating volcanic situation, not a direct trigger event. So where does that leave us right now, as of right now, with the information available? Colombia is dealing with 2 separate serious natural hazard situations, happening at the same time in overlapping regions of the country. You've got a magnitude 7.4 earthquake the strongest this specific area has felt in a very long time, with a death toll that started at 111 and has already climbed to at least 132, with 570 people injured and thousands more reported missing, a number that is almost certainly going to keep rising over the coming days as rescue teams reach more remote and rural areas. You've got aftershocks still happening, with the most dangerous window statistically being right now, in these first days after the main event, threatening buildings that are already structurally weakened. You've got landslide and soil liquefaction warnings covering hundreds of thousands of people, made worse by incoming rain in exactly the region that took the worst damage. And running alongside all of that, completely independently according to Colombia's own scientists, you've got a volcano that had already reached its highest documented alert level in over 3 decades, weeks before the earthquake even happened, and which continues to produce ash emissions that are disrupting air travel across the region. None of these 3 things happened in isolation, and none of them happened without warning either. The volcano's escalation was tracked and publicly announced starting August 1st. The seismic risk in this part of Colombia had been flagged by researchers more than a decade ago, and the earthquake itself, once it happened, revealed just how untested the region's buildings actually were, because nothing this strong had hit the area in roughly 90 years. So when I say Colombia got hit by 3 separate warnings that had been building for weeks, I mean that literally, and I think that's actually the most important thing to understand about this entire disaster, more than any single number. This wasn't an event that came out of absolutely nowhere. The signs were there. They were documented, they were publicly available, and they were still not enough to prevent what happened on Monday morning, because that's often just the brutal reality of living somewhere with active fault lines and active volcanic systems. You can track every instrument, issue every alert, and still end up with buildings collapsing and people trapped under rubble, because knowing a risk exists and being able to stop it from happening are 2 completely different things. Right now, the priority on the ground is straightforward, even if it's incredibly difficult in practice. Rescue teams are racing against a closing window, trying to reach people trapped under collapsed structures before that window shifts from rescue to recovery. They're doing that work on unstable ground during an active aftershock sequence, with rain in the forecast that threatens to trigger landslides on top of everything else, and in some areas with limited road access and communication because of how remote parts of the affected region actually are. The death toll you're hearing right now is not the final number. Based on how similar disasters have unfolded before in this exact region and in neighboring Venezuela earlier this year, that number is very likely still climbing and probably will be for days or even weeks to come. I'll obviously keep tracking this as more confirmed information comes out, both on the earthquake side and on what's happening with Pereira, because this is very clearly still an unfolding, developing situation, not something that wrapped up on Monday afternoon. Numbers you hear today might already be outdated by the time you finish watching this video, and that's just the nature of covering something this fast-moving and this fluid. Thank you so much for watching this one all the way through, guys. If you want to see the raw footage from the moment the buildings actually came down, I've got that covered in my first video on this. I'll link it for you. This one was really about walking you through everything that's happened since. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.